She needed a date for Christmas. She needed dignity more than anything. So the Mafia Boss said, "Pretend it's me." The message blinked across Lydia's screen like a dare. Jason, once the man she thought she would marry, had RSVP to her family's Christmas dinner with a new girlfriend pinned to his arm. A photograph proof of moving on. And evidence of leaving without a goodbye. Lydia's fingers trembled on the keyboard before she slid the screen closed as if shutting a window on cold air. The office smelled like burnt coffee and tinsel. Someone had hung a stray strand of lights over the reception desk, and no one had the heart to take them down. People passed her with holiday mugs, humming quiet carols, congratulating each other on end-of-year wins. Lydia felt like a photo negative in the middle of a living room. Colors inverted, everything ordinary turned sharp with the ache of being watched. Humiliation was practical. It had a checklist. The family group chat would explode with pitying hearts. Aunt May would ask where her ring had gone. Grandma would repeat, kindly and loud, that everything happens for a reason. Lydia imagined Jason leaning back in her father's armchair, telling stories about their engagement like a finished project. She imagined the cousins leaning forward to hear what had happened, eager for drama. The thought made bile rise behind her teeth. She had only asked for one thing, one quiet evening where she could answer polite questions and move on without the traces. She had her snow globe, the one her grandmother gave her when she moved into her apartment. And that small globe felt like the only thing that hadn't betrayed her. It sat on her desk, condensation forming on the inside like a tiny, safe world. When Lydia tapped it with a fingernail, the fake snow fell and the plastic church steeple glittered, and for a moment the motion steadied her. He was impossible to ignore. Ethan Morelli had an aura that made the office floor plan feel like a chessboard. He moved through rooms like a rumor. Everything bent toward him and then quieted. The tabloids called him many things. The city called him others. People whispered Don in classes of the same breath that named his philanthropic dinners and his hotels that smelled like cedar and lemon. He was on an island of his own making, and he walked it in suits the color of wet asphalt. He was also her boss. Lydia reported to him 2 levels down, in a building where glass walls kept conversations honest and secrets obvious. She had learned to balance the awkwardness of respecting a man who commanded headlines and fearing the possibility of being observed until she shivered. She had learned to fold her presence small, like napkins at a formal table. So when Ethan stepped into the open plan and said, low enough that his voice had to ease across the heads in the room to reach her, I almost dropped her pen. He wore a navy coat that looked expensive enough to have been made of night. The collar brimmed with the faint scent of tobacco and rosemary, oddly domestic. Jason RSVP'd with a +1, she said. Her mouth felt dry, the humor of the office suddenly far away. With a girlfriend. Ethan's face did not change. He leaned back against the marble counter and folded his hands. He watched the lights on the tree near the reception blink like an old camera. "They're doing a dinner?" he asked. He made it a question that measured the room. Lydia felt exposed. She did not answer that he'd be there, that he'd be invited into the stories of her childhood home. She only said, "I don't want to be made a spectacle." That was the language of the vulnerable, clear, short, and unarguable. Ethan nodded like he understood fragility as a fact, not as a moral failing. "Come to my office," he said. People parted politely, as they did for thunderstorms. When she closed the glass door behind them, the world narrowed to the 2 of them and the warm, dark impression of oak. His office was quiet in a way that felt curated. Books in soft leathers, framed photographs of solemn faces at charity galas, and a single plant that had survived much because someone watered it carefully. Lydia realized she had come to expect ritual from him. A quiet entrance, a closed door, the same 2 chairs arranged precisely, the same cup always at a precise angle. Rituals, she thought, were a way people controlled the unpredictable. He sat and put his hands on the desk as if that anchored him to the present. "What do you want me to do?" he asked. It was not the question she'd expected. She had rehearsed small, passive answers. She had imagined him offering a curt, corporate condolence. But the way he asked, direct, without pity and without performance, made something like relief flicker through her. She said it plainly. "I need a date for Christmas. Someone to come, to be with me, to make sure I don't sit through questions I don't want to answer. Just for the night. No headlines, no engagement, no, charitable takeovers. I need dignity." The last word tasted strange, like a confession she'd been keeping private. He considered the word dignity as if turning it over in his hands. "You want?" He paused, and his eyes, which were usually as guarded as bank vaults, softened. "Pretend it's me." The absurdity of the offer should have been funny. Instead, it landed like an anchor. Lydia felt the space around her compress. Pretend. The word offered a solution and risk in a single breath. His reputation meant she would not be the only subject of speculation, but it also meant anything linked to him could explode into publicity in ways she could not predict. But the alternative, facing the room of her relatives with Jason's smiling face at her edges, felt worse. Consent had to be hers. She met his gaze and said, "I'm not asking you to lie for me if it will hurt you. I'm asking you to be my date. Just sit next to me. If it goes sideways, I can stop it." "You can stop it," he repeated. He said it like a promise and not an order. "You pick the word." She thought for a moment and chose something domestic, not showy. "Eggnog," she said. The bright, ridiculous sweetness of it made her smile despite herself. It was a word they could both say in a crowded room, and no one would expect alarm. "Eggnog," he agreed. He said it like taking a key. They spent the next hour building the fiction, because even lies require scaffolding. Ethan wanted the scaffolding to be perfect. They rehearsed a story that placed them as old friends rather than lovers, a shorter truth, easier to defend. He suggested habits she could attribute to him. He laughed easily at her father's puns. He brought a bouquet of grocery store rosemary because he knew her mother loved the scent. He knew the name of her grandmother's dog. She told him where Aunt May liked to sit and who kept the good crackers behind the sugar bowl. They practiced introductions, small physical cues, a hand at the small of her back as they approached the staircase, an arm offered when she rose, nothing intimate that would read as a stolen truth. At each detail, Lydia put up a boundary like a fence post. When he asked about holding hands, she said no. When he suggested faking a kiss if Jason attempted theatrics, she slowed him with a look. "We don't need to stoop to that," she said. He shrugged. "I never wanted to humiliate anyone." His voice had, for the first time, a visible fatigue beneath it. He was not the man of roadless certainty she'd imagined. He was a man who had made choices that left him isolated. That isolation, she realized, was an invitation and a warning. He had power, yes, but he had loneliness too. Before she left the office, Lydia picked up her snow globe. He watched her carefully as she held it out. The little church inside rocked with her thumb, a tiny storm in glass. "It's mine," she said. "My grandmother gave it to me." He nodded as if he understood what talismans were worth. "I like talismans," he said. "I have a key ring with a chipped coin my grandmother gave me." He pulled it from his pocket, but didn't offer it. It was a small, private detail. Lydia felt both flattered and wary that he used a mirror instead of a spotlight. She tucked the globe back on her desk as if placing trust there would keep everything in place. She walked home through streets dusted with early December frost. Store windows brimmed with promise. In the space of 2 hours, the city had slid a different hue on her problems. The glitter did not make the bruise vanish. She texted her sister, Abby, with the succinct facts. "Jason is coming. I asked Ethan to be my date." Abby sent a string of heart emojis, followed by, "Are you insane? That's him." Family group chats are small courts. Opinions arrived like court papers. Lydia ignored the swirl. She had made a decision. The safe word was set. The parameters were in writing between her and him, and he had agreed to a boundary she had chosen. At home, she cleaned a jar of cinnamon tea and steamed up a mug. The apartment smelled of rosemary and old paperbacks. Her snow globe caught the afternoon light and threw it into 100 tiny lights across her kitchen counter. She thought of the night to come and how proud she would be if she could return without drama, with the quiet dignity she had asked for. She imagined, briefly, Jason seeing them at the door. The rumor would be that she had moved on or been adopted by someone far more dangerous. Either way, she would not have to explain. That felt like leverage, and leverage felt like a strange kind of comfort. She slept in short pieces, like a broken film reel. When morning came, she found a message waiting. A single line from Ethan's assistant, asking if she would come in early for a quick run-through with his public relations team. Lydia felt the room tilt. Nothing involving Ethan was ever as private as she had hoped. But the alternative was to refuse and let unpracticed improvisation rule the night. She chose practice. The PR meeting had fluorescent lights and a couch that gave just enough to suggest warmth without inviting naps. The team was small and efficient. 2 women with perfectly matte lips, a man with a headset and a polite grin. They presented a neutral script that was a map for the evening. Mr. Morelli will accompany Mrs. Bennet, the script said, using both formal names as if that would lend distance. No details on the personal nature of their relationship will be released. Any press inquiries will be addressed with the following line: "We are close friends and appreciate your concern." The phrase was antiseptic. It smelled of damage control and little else. Lydia agreed because it was simple, because it promised there would be no leaked narratives about broken engagements and bitter exes. Ethan watched the exchange like someone making notes on a life he did not fully inhabit. When the PR lead asked Lydia if she wanted to add anything, she surprised herself. "Tell them we're old friends who fell back into each other after years apart," she said, remembering a phrase that sounded both plausible and safe. It would imply history, not intimacy. It would be small and durable like a coin under a pillow. They practiced ways to appear comfortable without touching. Ethan's assistant taught Lydia how to angle herself in photographs: posture, chin tilt, soft smiles. It was silly, and yet watching how they moved through light and camera made Lydia realize how much of life is a set of small calculations. Outside the PR office, the city had become a place of headlines and small storms. Ethan's public image was like a weather system. It gathered attention without always leaving rain. People in the lobby tapped their phones as if checking for signs. Lydia's phone buzzed with a message from her mother: "Dress warm." Then from Abby: "Be charming or be scary, choose one." She forced a laugh. She wanted to rehearse feeling brave, not just making a brave face. They planned the drive together. Ethan's car was long and smelled faintly of cedar. He did not hold her hand. He offered the space for her to reach without anticipation. On the way, the city unfurled like a practiced scene. People glanced at the car and then away, the way people did with famous things that were also their distance. There was a curious intimacy in the small things they shared on the drive. He knew, to her astonishment, that she ordered black coffee with a splash of oat milk at the corner cafe. He remembered a childhood complaint about Aunt May's stuffing recipe. There were soft pauses where no one spoke, and the road hummed, and Lydia felt something else settling around her chest. Not love yet, not even liking, but an ease like a hand sliding into a glove. It made her wary because ease could be a trap, and because he had power she could never fully match. She reminded herself she had the safe word. She had chosen the rules. She had agency. They arrived at Lydia's mother's house to a scene that smelled of cinnamon and roast and familial chaos. The windows glowed. cousins raced through the yard with paper crowns stuck crookedly on their heads. Inside, the house was loud with the comfort of belonging. Lydia's grandmother sat in her usual chair by the mantel. The snow globe was on the shelf behind her. It gleamed, a reflection of contained storms and church steeples. Introductions were a small ceremony. Ethan extended a hand with the kind of practiced warmth that suggested he had practiced 100 versions of himself. "Ethan Morelli," he said to Lydia's father, whose eyebrows rose in a way that signaled both assessment and a mild welcome. He spoke not as a man used to commanding a room, but as one used to measuring people before choosing to inhabit the space they offered. He asked about their holiday plans, about Grandma's cough, about the dog. He listened as if each response mattered. Lydia watched her family navigate him. Aunt May tried to slip a question in about his business, but diverted when she realized she could not thread the needle. Her father cracked a pun about the cranberry sauce, and Ethan laughed like an ally. It was instructive to see him behave like this among amateurs of power. He softened around them, not for their celebrity, but because it was easier to show warmth where the stakes were personal and clear. Dinner was a pageant of mise-en-scène. People toasted and passed plates. Lydia engaged in the choreography they had rehearsed. The arm offered, the smile anchored at the eyes, the small nods that said she was fine without pretending too hard. When Jason stood to say a few words, Lydia felt the air tense as if the house itself held its breath. He spoke carefully, all polished charm and newly minted calm. He said, to Lydia and her family, in the way of a man returning a borrowed confidence. Halfway through his brief toast, Jason made a joke about moving on. A laugh, careful and clipped, circled the table. Lydia's face warmed with the sting of embarrassment. She felt 1,000 eyes collect on her like coins in a palm. For a moment, she thought of slipping out, of letting the heat of her cheeks carry her to the kitchen. Then Ethan stood. What he did was simple. He lifted his glass, looked at Lydia, and said, "To the woman who taught me how to believe in the small things again." The sentence was pure and unexpected. It did not stake claim so much as it named her with care. The room paused, and then, as if permission had been granted, they laughed and accepted the toast. It was during those small gestures that Lydia understood a thing about power. It could cover you, or it could cloak you. Ethan's presence had the effect of making people less inclined to be cruel, not because of fear alone, but because he gave people a way to step back. That was protection without humiliation. It was a skill, and one Lydia had not expected to be offered with gentleness. Later, when she walked him to the coat closet, Jason intercepted them with a smile like an accusation. "Nice to see you, Lydia," he said with the kind of casual intimacy that felt sharp enough to cut. Ethan stepped forward in a calm that had edges. He did not snarl or threaten. He did not do anything the movies promised. He simply said, "Jason, good to see you as well." His voice was soft but precise. He turned slightly so Lydia could step past him, and saw that in the crowd people were reorienting themselves, not because of a threat, but because the room had been given permission to redirect its attention elsewhere. After the dinner, Lydia thought she would breathe. Instead, she woke in the night to the sound of her phone. A photo of her and Ethan had circulated, a snapped backstage image from when Aunt May had insisted on a picture by the mantel. Someone had posted it with a caption that invited speculation. Within moments, it had been screenshot and reshared, annotated and captioned. In the cold light of her kitchen, she watched the image grow legs and run. Her stomach filled with a familiar tightness. Ethan's team moved swiftly, a shadow choreography Lydia had only glimpsed. An assistant texted her a short, neutral line they wanted to put out. "Mr. Morelli and Miss Bennett are longtime friends. We appreciate your concern." It was simple, sterile, the sort of thing meant to hold the shape of the story without filling it with anything scandalous. Lydia stared at the line. She felt a strange combination of gratitude and unease. He had a team, he had influence, he had a method for diluting rumors without turning them into headlines. He had power, and he used it, quickly and cleanly. She was not powerless. She had asked for help, she had agreed to a fiction, she had chosen a word to stop it if she needed to. But the image pulsed on her screen like a reminder that lives under public attention change density. They attract pressure from every angle. She texted back a single word, "Okay." It was the only answer that fit in the small hour. A PR statement was sent, and the rumor eased, though not entirely. It became a whisper that curled through the towns and landed, eventually, like sleet, unexpected, unavoidable, leaving tracks. A week later, a single screenshot landed on Jason's social feed, handsomely captioned with a sliver of insinuation about Lydia's motives. It was meant to be a jab disguised as a joke. For Lydia, it hit like a cold wind. She felt exposed again, the way paper loses integrity underwater. She called Abby and asked her to come over. Her sister arrived with a casserole and a face that read worry and defiance in equal measure. "You did the only reasonable thing," Abby said as she flung off her coat. "And him? He's a mess." Lydia knew being reasonable was not the same as being without consequence. She also understood that by inviting Ethan into one night, she had allowed a life with many lenses to lean on her. She had wanted dignity. Instead, she had begun to be interesting. Ethan's private side remained an enigma wrapped in a softness Lydia had not expected. He sent a single text that night, no gossip, no commentary, just, "Did we hold to the plan?" He ended with an ellipsis that read as a question. She replied, "Yes, eggnog, remember?" He sent back a single emoji, a small glass. The late-night PR calls came next. They were clinical, brisk. Ethan's head of PR suggested a neutral photograph, a single shot of two friends leaving the house, no holding hands, no intimate gestures. Lydia agreed because she preferred to be known as someone who chose her parameters. Yet in the private messages, she found small kindnesses. A note about her grandmother's cough improving, a suggestion to bring extra cranberry sauce in case her aunt liked to ask for seconds. He was watchful in ways that were solicitous rather than suffocating. By the time snow fell in true sheets, Lydia had folded the experience into a manageable layer of her life. She rehearsed answers for the inevitable questions. She practiced the safe word in her head as if it were a spell. Yet the world kept delivering small surprises. A local blogger speculated on Ethan's motives. A cousin posted a candid video that made the PR office call for edits. A neighbor asked Lydia in the supermarket if she was seeing someone new. Each small moment added to a quiet thrum behind her ribs, a noise that made it difficult to tell where performance ended and feeling began. Ethan, for his part, continued to behave like a man who took the weight of attention seriously. He kept his distance when it mattered. He respected the fences Lydia had put up. Lydia agreed because she preferred to be known as someone who chose her parameters. Yet in the private messages, she found small kindnesses. A note about her grandmother's cough improving, a suggestion to bring extra cranberry sauce in case her aunt liked to ask for seconds. He was watchful in ways that were solicitous rather than suffocating. By the time snow fell in true sheets, Lydia had folded the experience into a manageable layer of her life. She rehearsed answers for the inevitable questions. She practiced the safe word in her head as if it were a spell. Yet the world kept delivering small surprises. A local blogger speculated on Ethan's motives. A cousin posted a candid video that made the PR office call for edits. A neighbor asked Lydia in the supermarket if she was seeing someone new. Each small moment added to a quiet thrum behind her ribs, a noise that made it difficult to tell where performance ended and feeling began. Ethan, for his part, continued to behave like a man who took the weight of attention seriously. He kept his distance when it mattered. He respected the fences Lydia had put up. When they shared spaces, he offered comfort in the form of small, almost trivial knowledge. The exact way Lydia liked her risotto, the brand of tea her grandmother preferred. It was disarmingly intimate to be known by such minor things. It was also the slowest, safest form of courtship, the accumulation of details that made the person on the other side feel seen and steady. Their fiction was a slow work in progress. It was both a shield and a mirror. Lydia found herself watching him in ways that had nothing at all to do with the headlines. There were moments, a pause when he listened to her father talk about plumbing troubles, a small flinch when her name was called in a crowded room, where she glimpsed the man beneath the myth. He was careful, not because he feared investigation, but because he had learned the cost of being careless. One evening, after a day of snow and small skirmishes with viral comments, Ethan invited Lydia to his hotel to drop off a leftover dessert. The hotel was a thing of understated elegance, a lobby that smelled of citrus and hot metal from the espresso machine. He led her to a suite that was more like a living room with a bed attached. Lydia felt the city's hush pressing against the glass. They sat on the couch with mugs and talked about nothing, the easiest topic for people trying to avoid rehearsed lines. He listened when she spoke of being abandoned, of the way Jason had slipped away. She did not want pity. She wanted someone to put her story on a table and look at it without making it smaller. "You're allowed to guard yourself," he said simply, "and you're allowed to change your mind." It was not the grand statement of a man used to giving orders. It was a permission he offered softly. Lydia felt the room tilt. It made her dizzy in the way that honest things sometimes did. She had no obligation to trust him, she reminded herself. She had no obligation to accept kindness because it came from power. But she also had the right to accept comfort. When she left that night, he walked her to the car and handed her a small wrapped package. "For Christmas," he said. She laughed because the timing was theatrical, but she took it. Inside, wrapped in tissue, was a tiny snow globe, not unlike hers but smaller, with a house instead of a church. It was the sort of gift people gave when they wanted to say, without words, "I noticed." She held it and felt something in her chest realigned like books on a shelf. The snow globe became a motif between them. It was a quiet sign that both protected and tethered. It did not eradicate the rumor mill, but it offered a private confirmation of shared territory, a moment of mutual recognition that kept away from public speculation. Not everything moved smoothly. Rumors persisted in corners that PR could not reach. A jealous ex with a social platform, an opportunistic columnist, a cousin who liked to stitch stories for laughs. The viral photograph that first started the chatter had been accompanied by a caption that promised more to come. Lydia's mother fretted. Aunt May overshared. Jason's occasional jabs continued like small, irritating currents. And somewhere in the background, the city watched. Ethan was aware of that gaze. He had adapted much of his life to the contour of public attention, and he knew how to shield people he cared about. But shielding has a cost. It means sometimes stepping into light you would not otherwise choose. It means making choices that ripple farther than you expect. Lydia had asked for protection for one night. The protection had begun to open doors she did not know she wanted to open. When the next storm of comments hit, a screenshot of a private message gone public, Lydia found herself on the phone with Ethan at dawn. He spoke in measured, soft bursts. "We'll keep to the script," he said. "No escalation." "And if he tries to make a scene?" Lydia asked. "Then we don't give him a stage," he replied. The reply was practical. It was also, subtly, an offer. He was saying he would not permit her to be humiliated on his watch. He was not promising to erase the past. He was promising to stand between her and the moment. Lydia felt the relief wash through her like a tide coming in. The story was not finished. It never would be all at once. But she had purchased, for now, a night of dignity, a trove of small mercies. The snow globes sat on her nightstand like twin moons. The word eggnog rested at the back of her throat like an emergency key. She had boundaries, and she held them. She had a man with an impossible reputation and a surprising gentleness to protect the edges of her life. Outside, the city lights blinked like a breath. Inside, the curtains were drawn against wind and gossip. Lydia put her head back on the pillow and thought, for the 1000th time, about choice, about what it meant to choose someone dangerous for comfort. about what it meant to allow yourself to be seen when your past had taught you to hide. She pressed her hand to the snow globe, felt the glass cool beneath her palm, and set it carefully on the shelf. Days later, just as everyone thought they had settled into a pattern, an unflattering screenshot of a private exchange landed on Jason's account. He, who had been smiling in photographs, now wrote a caption timed perfectly for maximum sting. It invited speculation and pity in equal measure. The comment thread swelled. Someone blurred the edges of truth into something grotesque and then sent it out to be copied. Lydia watched it grow. She felt the familiar coil of dread tighten, but this time there was also a steadiness to her breath. She had a plan and a safe word and a man who had agreed in clear terms to protect her. She had small rituals and snow globes and pockets of careful intimacy that had nothing to do with headlines. She texted Ethan. She did not use eggnog. Not yet. She closed her eyes and hit send. I don't want to be dragged into this. His reply came within a minute. You won't be. You won't be. Those two words arrived like a blanket. Lydia read them again, felt the letters settle into her palms. For the first time since the photograph began to multiply, the tightness behind her ribs eased enough for her to breathe without counting. It wasn't the end of the noise, she knew that. It was simply the knowledge that someone had moved to stand between her and the immediate next wave of hurt. She put the phone down and let the quiet of dawn sit with her for a moment. Outside, the city was a slow machine of headlights and steam. Inside, her small apartment was a collage of things she loved and had been reluctant to replace after the engagement fell apart. The chipped mug she used for tea, her grandmother's crocheted throw, the two snow globes on the nightstand like twin moons. One of them, the tiny house globe Ethan had given her, wobbled ever so slightly in the morning light and shook up snow that seemed to be waiting to settle. Some things, she thought, could be protected. Protecting them did not mean making them new. It meant keeping the fragile places from being stomped flat by an impatient crowd. She dressed with a care that felt like armor, a sweater that fit like a hand, a coat that had pockets large enough to hold a few spare tissues, gloves that did not make her hands clumsy. When she left, the air hit her face like credit, cold, crisp, honest. The next days were a study in micro-tactics. Ethan's PR operation, never labeled more dramatically than team, moved like a quiet staff. They issued the neutral line, fielded soft inquiries, and refused to slide into either denial or proclamation. Their message was a shield with smooth, even edges. Mr. Morelli and Miss Bennett are longtime friends. We appreciate your concern. It did what it could. Rumor slowed from a torrent to an undercurrent. But rumor has a private persistence. Jason, who had always been proficient at weaponizing small things, found new platforms and small alliances. He posted a photo of himself framed with a caption that read like a thesis on charming indifference. Someone tagged Lydia with a comment that tried to turn pity into spectacle. The same cousin who loved a good story posted videos from the dinner with a filter that made everything look like a confessional. It was a slow attrition of privacy, a little erosion each day. Lydia learned to treat those moments as she would a bruise. Clean it, dress it, leave it to heal. She called Abby more often than felt strictly necessary, which Abby took as a kindness and a responsibility. Lydia cooked because cooking required rhythm and concentration, and the heat of a pan could put panic at bay. She sliced rosemary the way her grandmother taught her, thin, coaxing the scent into the room like a small, persistent comfort. Ethan's presence around those days was consistent but never intrusive. He sent a message in the afternoon that said, "Cranberry sauce?" It was not an invitation. It was a question with the weight of a person checking a box for someone else. Lydia laughed in the quiet of her kitchen and texted back, "Too much. I'll see if Aunt May leaves any." When he turned up at her door 2 days later with a paper bag, she opened it to find 2 small jars of preserves and a wrapped loaf of bread warm from the bakery. "For your family," he said. "Grandma's loaf at the bakery has a secret ingredient." He was amused in a way that suggested he had spent more time thinking of this than was necessary for a simple errand. It was the kind of attention that made her feel seen and new, small domestic gestures that could not be amplified into headlines because they were rooted in the ordinary. She accepted the gifts and invited him in for coffee because politeness still applied even under the glaring possibility of gossip. They sat at her small table with the snow globes between them like tokens. The afternoon light made the dust motes move like tiny urban galaxies. "I know this is wrong," Lydia said quietly, stirring sugar into her coffee as if rhythm could wrestle the past into order. "I know it's complicated." "It is," he answered, "and you're allowed to say that without apology." She studied his profile as he spoke, the slope of his cheek, the habitual tightness at the corner of his mouth that appeared when he was measuring. "Why do you do this?" she asked, because honesty had a way of creating its own room. He set his cup down with deliberate care. "Because someone once did for me," he said, and the sentence was simple enough to be truthful. "Because I was taught that when you have an audience, you can use it to keep people safe, not just to make people watch." Lydia imagined the audience he spoke of like weather, something that could be generous or dangerous, depending on how you directed it. "Doesn't it cost you?" she asked. "Yes," he replied. "It costs me distance. It costs choices. It costs being read as an object rather than a person." He looked at her then, not through her. "But I picked some of those costs long ago." The way he said it was not a plea. It was an inventory. There was no expectation that she would see it as noble. She could have walked away. She could have asked him to stop. Instead, she felt an odd curiosity, not about his power, but about the person behind it. It was as if the rumor and the aura had been a fog that finally, guiltily, cleared. They continued meeting for small domestic exchanges that felt like rehearsals for a life that might someday be ordinary. They discussed books instead of headlines, the architecture of places they liked instead of the architecture of rumor. He told her once about his grandmother's chipped coin, the one she had given him for luck. He kept it on a ring as a private talisman. In return, Lydia told him about the first time she had shaken a snow globe and felt comforted by the notion of a controlled storm. Those evenings built a soft architecture between them. Trust, not as a single grand event, but as a series of small, agreed actions. She trusted him to keep boundaries his public stature might have tempted him to cross. He trusted her to name when a limit had been reached and to use eggnog without hesitation if the night ever became too much. Then Jason pushed. He found a way to place a whisper in the right ear at the right time. At a town fundraiser, a genteel evening intended to stitch together neighbors and donors, Jason arrived with a smile that said he had come to show he still mattered. He moved through the room with that practiced half-step of someone who was trying to appear larger than he felt. Lydia had been asked to attend by her mother, who believed in showing face as an act of civic courage. She almost declined until the thought of what it would mean to let one more thing slide made her skin prickle. Ethan came too, not to stage anything, but because he had offered and she had accepted. The fundraiser venue smelled like fried dough and citrus, a hall strung with fairy lights and the murmur of small talk. Ethan walked beside Lydia as if they were two people who had simply agreed to be present to the same event. There was nothing performative about the way he shifted his coat or the way he listened to a candidate for the town board. He used his presence like a polite umbrella, not a barricade. Jason found them near a table of pamphlets and tried to corner Lydia with what he had hoped would be a dagger disguised as a compliment. "Lydia," he said in that smooth, practiced register, "you look well." The sentence landed like a glove, soft and fitting. She answered with the cool steadiness she had practiced. "Jason." He laughed the kind of laugh that is used to claiming the room. "I was surprised at the turnout tonight. People like reunions. You and we have history." The line was meant to be a lever. He might have said more. He might have hinted at scandal, at betrayal. Instead, he chose to walk the edge of insinuation and left the rest for others' imaginations to fill. For a moment, it seemed the room would leak toward him. Ethan listened with a face that did not sharpen. When Jason finished, Ethan folded his hands and said, clear as a chime, "Lydia is her own person. The rest is noise." There was no flourish, no dramatics. He did not need to denounce Jason or to call the room to arms. He simply placed a fact on the table that reframed everything. People who had been leaning toward the rumor straightened. There was something disarming about a man with his reputation being mundane in defense of another person. Jason scoffed, as if the truth had been a personal slight. "Are you doing this for optics?" he asked, the way men do when they want a performance to be judged as a theater piece. Ethan smiled coolly, and there was nothing theatrical about it. It was the smile of someone who had expected the question. "I do not confuse people with theater," he said. "Miss Bennet asked for dignity. I am merely respecting that request." The room, which had been a small theater of conjecture, shifted away from gossip. Jason tried one more move, a casual mention of the wedding that never was, a caricature of Lydia's heartbreak meant to appear as a joke. Ethan stepped between them with the gentlest of motions and guided Lydia toward the refreshments table. He did not speak loudly. He did not brand Jason. He simply provided a slope for the evening to continue without blood. Lydia walked away with heat in her cheeks, but also with a strange sense of victory. Not because he had been proved wrong, but because she had not had to call eggnog. No alarm had been used. Her hand had not trembled with a panic that required the safety of a word. She had felt present enough to accept protection when it had been offered and to keep her choices. Back home that night, the city outside a smear of headlights, Lydia sat at her kitchen table and looked at her snow globes. They had become a private language between her and Ethan, a sign that they had traded something small and personal in a world that otherwise repackaged moments to sell. She ran a finger along the glass and felt the cool surface, and imagined the tiny houses and churches and people inside, stuck in their own small storms. She liked the metaphor enough to be embarrassed by it. She liked it because it did not claim to be a fix. It was simply a way to keep something steady. The weeks that followed were a series of small tests. Sometimes they were external. An opportunistic journalist, a cousin who liked to stitch gossip into a sweater of attention. Sometimes they were internal. Lydia's own mind pulling her backwards to the moment Jason left, to the sound of a door shutting and a life unlived. She had nights when she woke and felt like she had nothing in her chest to hold on to. On those nights, she would take the smaller snow globe and hold it until the panic slowed. Ethan remained a steady presence. He was present in ways that did not require explanations. He came with a scarf when she opened her door to the storm one morning, as if he had known the temperature would take a turn. He called in the afternoon to ask about a detail of her grandmother's cough, as if those small domestic threads mattered because they were, ultimately, the weight of ordinary life. One evening in late January, after a week of gray that made the city look like a charcoal sketch, Lydia found herself standing in Ethan's hotel kitchen. He had invited her to help with dinner, or, more accurately, he had asked if she would accept his worst risotto, and she had laughed because the idea of cooking together felt like a private rebellion against the public glare. The sweet smelled like simmered stock and the vanishing citrus of his discarded napkin. He had left the window open despite the cold, and the night air brought stars like pinpricks. Cooking at his stove felt illicit only in that it was a small intimacy that could not easily be turned into a headline. Lydia stirred, tasted, added salt, and caught his eye across the steam. "You seem less like an island when you're in aprons," she teased, and the laugh between them felt easy. He smiled. "I've never been great at islands," he said. "They're lonely by definition." She watched him stir, and then, because the house between them had been built out of small things, she dared to ask a question that had been growing in the quiet. "Are you forever, afraid that your choices that they'll be misread, he finished for her. He did not look away. Yes, every day. But fear is not the same as cowardice. I learned a long time ago that if you always react to fear, you never choose a life. You just live its margins. There was a humility about him that surprised Lydia. Not theatrical, not performative, but honest and slightly weary. She found herself telling him things she had not told anyone. How Jason had gone quiet weeks before their engagement ended, the small signs she had missed because she wanted them to be otherwise. Telling it did not fix it. It simply made the story smaller because it was no longer folded up inside her like a secret. When she finished speaking, Ethan picked up one of the snow globes from the counter, the little house one he had given her, and shook it. The powdered snow fell like a soft applause. People think they get to map another person's life from the outside, he said. They forget that inside someone is messy and full of living history. I prefer to see the living history. You make it sound effortless, she said. It's not, he replied, but nobody gets to be brave by themselves. There was no romantic fanfare in the suite, no music swelled. What happened was quieter. The two of them cooked, ate, and then sat across from each other at his small table with the city humming like a distant neighbor. When she left, he handed her a slim envelope. For your family, he said. Inside, folded and neat, were tickets, a small escape for the weekend. A cabin? She asked, surprised. A cabin, he confirmed. No PR, no phone, just snow. It was precisely the kind of offer that was both generous and intimidating. It would be private, but it also required trust. Lydia weighed the idea like a coin, examining the edges. She could say no, she could say yes. She chose because the option to refuse had always been the currency she guarded most fiercely. The cabin, when they arrived, was the kind of place people wrote about in magazines, with careful lighting and invented warmth. It had a porch that held the cold at bay and a fireplace that made the air smell like wood and promise. Snow lay on everything like a soft apology. The world outside was muffled in its own quiet. Inside, the lamplight made the room look like something stitched together by hand. Ethan let her remove her boots and offered her his coat. For a week, their only audience was one another and the occasional deer-shaped shadow that passed the window. They established small routines. Coffee in the morning in chipped mugs, a walk across a frozen lake where they listened to nothing at all. There was a particular cadence to the days, the kind that settles when life is measured not by headlines but by teaspoons. On the third night, after dinner, and after a lull of conversation that had been comfortable enough to name as rare, Ethan took out a small wooden box from beneath a pile of magazines. He set it on the coffee table between them. You don't have to open it, he said softly. She looked at him, then at the box. It was plain, the kind of box that promised nothing and therefore could hold anything. She opened it because curiosity, like a small river, always finds the path of least resistance. Inside was a snow globe, clear glass, a tiny ring sitting hidden inside on a little velvet cushion. Her breath caught in a way that felt sacramental. She lifted the globe and turned it in her hands. The ring inside was simple and warm, the kind of thing that slid into the seam of the story without fanfare. She felt both ridiculous and deeply moved. Is this, she began. He put the box down and looked at her with an intensity that was not to intimidate, but to be present. He reached for a chair and knelt before her in a motion that felt ancient and honest, a gesture not meant for any camera lens. The floor creaked like an old conscience. There was no PR team. There were no cameras. The cabin had only the soft tick of the heater and the small flutter of paperbacks. Lydia Bennett, he said, and his voice had the calm of someone who had been practicing the truth. I cannot promise you an easy life. I will never pretend to make your past disappear. I will not erase the things that hurt you. But I will stand with you and next to you and near you, and I will ask your permission every step of the way. I want to be the person who helps build the quiet parts of life again with you, if you would let me." He opened the snow globe, the snow inside shimmering as if to celebrate. He did not produce a speech about destiny or rescue. He produced a ring and a question that was exactly the size it needed to be. Lydia felt her throat go dry, not from fear, but from the strangest mix of relieved exhaustion and the dawning sense that she could make this choice without coercion. "How do I know this isn't protection masquerading as promise?" she asked. Because honesty had been the wood that kept their nights from splintering. "You don't," he admitted, "and that's fair. Trust is not a one-time purchase. It's an ongoing subscription to risk. I don't expect you to opt in on day one. I'm only asking that you decide, if you want to, that we will practice trust together." She thought about the safe word, eggnog, and how many times she had felt its comfort in her pocket without needing to use it. She thought of the nights she had woken to the sound of her own breath and wondered if love could ever be an arrangement that did not feel like giving up autonomy. She thought of the small things, the way he remembered how she liked her risotto, the way he had moved, not to own moment, but to protect the margins of it. She met his eyes. "If I say yes," she asked, "does that mean I'm saying yes to everything?" "No," he said. "It means you're saying yes to trying, with boundaries. It means you stay in control. It means eggnog stays a thing you can use. It means you can change your mind at any time." There was an entire history in that small clause, the recognition that people with power could speak in ways that preserved the power dynamic or that dissolved it. Lydia's answer would be shaped by the kind of respect he was willing to offer in practice, not the kinds of promises that sound good in the cold light of dramatics. She picked up the little globe with the ring inside and felt the glass warm under her fingers. She opened it, and when she slipped the ring onto her finger, the small fit felt right in a way that was less about perfection and more about possibility. "Yes," she said, and the word landed like a careful decision rather than a surrender. He rose and took her hand, and there was no public announcement, no fanfare that would feed headlines. There was only the quiet of the cabin and the snow pressing its own soft punctuation against the world. He kissed her then, in a way that honored consent and comfort, neither hurried nor ceremonial. It was a kiss that said, "I will try." It was a kiss made of the small components that had woven them together: attention, persistence, and the willingness to be seen without editing. They slept that night with the snow globe on the bedside table between them, the tiny ring resting inside like a promise that required work. In the morning, Lydia woke with the strange sense of a life rearranged, not by spectacle, but by the accumulation of small acts. The weeks that followed were not a neat arc of drama and resolution. There were awkward dinners with family, questions that came wrapped in the best intentions, and the occasional headline that sought to make a narrative where none needed to exist. Jason continued to pop up like a chorus of a song they had chosen to stop singing. He tried the occasional barbed comment, a social post that aimed to rename Lydia as a trophy. Those things came and go, and often they were painful, but they no longer felt like a dam breaking. They were smaller, contained, and met with a rhythm they could manage together. Ethan continued to be respectful in public and private. He was not a man of grand cinematic rescues. He was a man of practical kindness, turning off a camera when it veered too close, stepping between a journalist and a personal question, not with intimidation, but with the graceful refusal to supply a spectacle. There were days when Lydia watched him and saw both the weight his reputation carried and the choice he made to let that weight be a tool for shelter rather than a weapon. That distinction mattered to her. On their first anniversary of sorts, the night they had agreed, in a way, to keep moving forward, Lydia brought out the original snow globe her grandmother had given her. She set it beside the new one and, without dramatics, told him a small story about the first time she had shaken it and felt the world rotate into order for a minute. He listened, and then, rather than producing some grand promise, he produced his own small gift, a key on a ring. It was plain and old-looking, not something that suggested purchase or entitlement. He handed it to her with a look that suggested he hoped she would keep it. "For the cabin," he said, "but also for whatever else we make of the ordinary." She accepted the key more for what it represented than for its metal. It was a symbol of permission, permission to enter a place that had, until then, been private to him, permission to keep a measure of the ordinary safe. Life settled into new rhythms. Mornings meant coffee brewed just so and the smell of toast and cinnamon. They had rituals small and private, a favorite spot at a booth in a diner, a way of arranging their coats so they did not step on each other like they were trying not to take up the same space. Friends became watchful, not gossiping. Lydia's family found their way to warmth, seeing her not as the object of a cautionary tale, but as someone who had made a decision about what dignity looked like and claimed it. Jason, slowly and with his own desperate grace, faded from being a daily presence in Lydia's mind. He remained human, but no longer occupied the axes of her days. Rumors lived like abandoned houses on the edge of town, visible from the road, but not necessary to enter. The town still had people who liked to stitch stories into the air, and sometimes they succeeded. But those were only threads in a larger tapestry that Lydia and Ethan were, deliberately and tenderly, working on. They hosted a small gathering at Lydia's family home the following winter. It was a quiet celebration of small things: a roasting pan of chestnuts, Grandma's knitting in the corner, the snow globe perched like a sentinel on the mantel. After dessert, when the candles had burned low and the children had been shushed into sleepy contentment, Ethan stood and raised his glass. He did not make a spectacle. He simply said, "To Lydia," and then, softly, "To the woman who taught me the value of keeping small things safe." In that moment, the room felt like a circle drawn gently outward. People laughed, smiled, and the evening continued in the way that family evenings do, messy, sincere, and warming. Jason was there as well, polite and aloof. He made a toast to good health and then left early, as if the night had exhausted a certain performance for him. Lydia felt a complex sense of closure. Not a dramatic reveal, but a quiet acknowledgement that stories change when the main character refuses to be written by others. Months later, on a weekday morning when the light fell through the curtains and everything smelled faintly of rosemary and hospitals and the real work of living, Lydia placed the snow globe that had held her ring on the mantel. Inside, the tiny ring glowed like a small and private sun. It was both an object and a reminder that the transformation had been incremental, tender, and most importantly, chosen. Ethan stood beside her as she adjusted it, his fingers brushing hers with the care of someone who knew not to force. She did not need a grand finale. She had a life that had been shaped by choices. Her choice to ask for help, her choice to name a safe word, her choice to say yes on a winter night when the world beyond the cabin was cold and indifferent. Those choices had not meant an erasure of hurt. They had meant an active participation in the next chapter. When she thought about the early days, the photograph that had begun the rumor, the trembling text to Abby, the desk snow globe on which she had rested her hand, she recognized how much of her own courage had been present all along. The snow globe had never been a shield, so much as a reminder that storms could be smaller if handled with care. Ethan had been an accomplice in that understanding, never replacing her voice, never making decisions she didn't consent to. They continued in the unglamorous, honest work of building trust. There were days when the past returned like a draft through a loose window, and she used eggnog once or twice when she felt the need, a code that remained for her, not to shame, but to anchor. He respected it, and in doing so, he preserved the balance that had allowed their quiet love to grow. Years later, when a new photograph of them appeared in a paper that had once been hungry for spectacle, the headline felt oddly undersized compared to the life they had. The story that day was not about scandal, but about two people who managed their lives away from the blinking of cameras and toward a slow domestic peace. Lydia read it with a calm that surprised her. She rested a hand on the snow globe and felt the glass warm from her skin. "You ever think about the kid who used to shake the globe and think life would settle?" she asked Ethan one evening as they put dishes in the sink and listened to the radio low in the background. He dried a plate and smiled, the way one smiles at a small and precise joke. "I think we're learning to shake it and let the snow fall where it may," he said.
Is that your way of saying you've stopped trying to control everything? She teased. Not stopped, he corrected, refined. They laughed. The laugh was private and long. When the night closed around them and the city beyond their window folded into the dark with bits of light like triumphant insects, Lydia felt her choices settle into a pattern. She had asked for dignity and been given offering. Not the erasure of pain, but the permission to stand in a life that she could shape. If someone asked her later whether she would have said yes to a love that began with pretending, she would have answered honestly, yes, but only because pretending was the thing that let her see the person willing to treat her choices as sovereign. To be loved was not the same as being saved. It was being offered the companionship of a person who would listen, who would protect without subsuming, who would kneel not to possess, but to ask. In the end, the snow globes stayed on the shelf, one with a little church, one with a little house, and one with a tiny ring hidden between white flakes. They were less about magic and more about memory, about the very human fact that people can choose differently if given the space to do so. And sometimes those choices create a life that, while imperfect, feels like a home. Would you take a chance on a love that starts with pretending? Tell us below.